Hello. In this last episode related to Chapter 4 of Economic Development, we're going to look at the use of growth diagnostics in practice with a special case of an interesting study that was done of the problems of inclusive growth that we're facing Bangladesh. And this was a joint product or project of USAID and UK aid in conjunction with Bangladesh. And so here the idea was in part to go beyond just growth, but think about inclusive growth. And their approach to inclusive growth in this case was specifically opportunities for lower income women. Sometimes this approach might focus on generally increasing the incomes of those in the bottom 40% at a faster rate of growth than those in the top 60%. That would be one example of an inclusive growth diagnostics possibility. This was looking specifically at inclusivity with respect to women. And so they started out with a general review of the different possible binding constraints, and they were able to rule some out fairly quickly. And so they narrowed these down then to 5 plausible ones based upon their overall review of the economy. And these were the candidate binding constraints that they looked at. And one was finance. And so they found it impossible to make a very strong case that finance was binding. There were some concerns. And so they recommended that maybe it's not an immediate issue, but the financial sector would have to get some clear attention in the years going forward. So we don't always have to think about growth diagnostics just in terms of what's binding now. We can look ahead. We can see that where the economy is, education is not really a problem, but where we expect it to be in 10 years, for example, if we don't have significant improvements in education, that will be a problem. And so because of legs, we still might want to give it some attention here. So it's sometimes lacking in discussions, but all of this can be given a dynamic aspect as well. So another possibility they looked at was market failure, such as coordination failures, as well as information externalities of the type that has been examined in Chapter 4 in the various sections leading up to the growth diagnostics section. And they found that these were important concerns, but they thought unlikely currently binding, given how severe other problems were. So they recommended other problems get attention. With respect to human capital, that was a possible binding constraint based on what they had looked at. And so they made special note of how girls' education progress had been so impressive in the case of Bangladesh compared especially to many otherwise at least somewhat similarly situated countries. This we saw in some detail in part in the case study for Chapter 1 of the textbook comparing Bangladesh with Pakistan. And so they noted that a lot had already been done. I don't think anyone doubted that it was desirable for more progress to be made, but they also noted that at this point in time, the returns to education is not particularly high. And so here, for example, the wage differential in getting to the next level, such as finishing 8th grade or finishing 12th grade, was not that high over those who had not. So it didn't mean education was not a problem going forward, but didn't seem to be the thing holding back economic growth, including inclusive economic growth right now. Another piece of detective work was found when they used firms surveys. So surveying companies and asking them about what the problems are that they see, that they face as they try to grow and expand their businesses is another very important piece of information that's widely used. And firms did not cite education among the various constraints that they saw. And also education does not explain international migration patterns, who is moving to work in the Middle East and things of this kind. And there's no clear relationship between the labor intensivity and growth industry by industry. So although it was very plausible to think about education as a binding constraint in Bangladesh, the evidence for it being the constraint now just wasn't there. So as a result, they did, however, draw attention to a couple of problems that at this time, education has fairly low quality in many areas of Bangladesh. And Moreover, a high variance that the best schools are producing great education and skills, and others are not. So they thought it would be possible as an emerging constraint going forward in the way that I was suggesting one could see earlier. Another possibility was government failure. And so that was one of our constraint areas. And so it was suggested maybe contract enforcement is a problem. They could not find really strong evidence for it, so they put that aside. Corruption. It's a little bit vague here. These things get a little vague sometimes, but the authors of this study said it was a most binding constraint. They also called it close to binding, but on a sector-by-sector basis. So binding, not quite binding, but close to being the key problem in some sectors, but maybe not others. So they thought maybe this is not the most pressing problem for Bangladesh at this point. Other evidence that they looked at were firm surveys. And of course, firms everywhere complain about corruption, but not unusually strongly or particularly strongly was it stressed in the firm surveys. Another thing that one can look at is international benchmarking. So for example, Transparency International has some corruption indices, and Bangladesh was not particularly out of whack, if you want, with respect to where it is on those indices. So, there's a lot of bribes that have to be paid, no question about it in Bangladesh. But that's not the point. Is that even there, they were around the middle of the pack in the set of comparator countries that were used, and below comparisons made with Cambodia and Philippines. And so they thought that, moreover, they couldn't find a clear relationship between the amount of corruption and the amount of investment. And so it's often very natural when people ask, well, what's the most binding constraint here? People will say corruption. It's something that is, it's a story that people very much hold in mind. And of course, corruption is a problem. It is something that has to be eradicated. It may not be the binding constraint on growth right now. And so maybe you need to put special emphasis on areas that are. This is the idea. Then, having done this work, the authors focused in on infrastructure and ultimately decided on what they saw, that electricity infrastructure was the most binding constraint. Maybe not what you would expect, but in terms of the differential diagnosis that we talked about, they found a lot of evidence highly consistent with this. First of all, with respect to the high shadow price, the team found that if you purchased non-grid electricity, it was several times that of bulk electricity in particular. So that, so that's off the grid. Let's get to that, other aspects of that in a moment. Okay, as far as movements in the constraint, shifting the objective, that is to say accelerating investment in this case, they found that expanded electricity availability geographically has been followed by higher electricity using investment. And they were not fully ready to say that we have strong causal evidence, but they had at least weak causal evidence and reason to think that this was causal. That the electricity became available, and as a consequence, causally, more investment took place in those areas. Always a tricky problem. What about bypassing of the constraints of electricity availability? They found that firms, and for that matter government, were using very expensive private generators. And so that if you're going to do so, that must mean that it has a high value, electricity availability does, for your activities, or else you wouldn't spend so much on it. And so that they also connected this constraint to building of export processing zones. So as to whether less intensive users of electricity were thriving the evidence they found was less clear. So, I like it when they report things like this. You know that they were, doing a thorough and kind of transparent job, when they also point out areas that are less obvious. But, a couple of areas being less obvious doesn't turn over the idea that this could be binding. So, thoughts about that for you. So, the team also proposed that greater electricity production capacity, and reliability, not having so many blackouts, would likely lead to increased formal sector employment. And the textiles industry was perhaps the most important here in that. And so, in sum, the authors concluded that electricity investment, that is to say, expanding the capacity to produce more electricity availability, would have the largest impact on growth. And they also concluded that it would have the most favorable impacts on employment and incomes for women, as women were often working in sectors, when they got out of the informal economy, got out of constraints, they were often working in sectors that actively used also electricity. And so this is the finding of that study. Perhaps it wasn't what we expected. I think that it illustrates very well, though, the process of going through the growth diagnostics exercise and following it where it will take us. Thanks.